loudly I'm speaking or how it sounds in the rest of the trolley. So forgive me if again, like I said, Pennsylvania Emergency Militia was raised to sort of face the emergency of the Confederate invasion, because the Union Army was still down in Virginia and Maryland trying to figure out, what Lee was doing, how they could best organize, and especially who was going to be in charge. Because Joseph Hooker, like I said, his head's on the chopping block. He's going to be out of here pretty soon. So Wrightsville is not undefended. A couple days before June 28th, there's a colonel under command of the 28th and 27th Pennsylvania Emergency Militia, called Colonel Jacob Frick. He was a veteran. He'd served in the war prior. He's in charge of the Pennsylvania Emergency Militia. Men who had seen about a week and a half of training, most of whom had never fired a gun before in their lives. And they began to build this sort of ovular-shaped defense around Wrightsville. Some of it actually sort of at the end of the cornfield there, where the houses are. They had built trenches, and they would have gone back the ridge, sort of following that line of houses there at the end of the cornfield. So as we come to the intersection at the Royal Farm, it's not a very dramatic way to describe the military maneuver, but as we come to the intersection, we see the engine of Wrightsville effectively is. So there was a toll gate there in Gainesville, and that was sort of the middle, the center of the Union line, is where the sort of oval came to a point. That's what we call a salient point that can be expressed, a dead point. That's sort of at the center of this big line. So this is the center of Jacob Frick's defensive position. And as we go out of town, we'll see there's a big dip. And Jacob Frick is hoping to use this as like high ground and defense of Wrightsville. So we'll see this dip that goes back up the hill. And right on the other side of the hill where the Confederates are going to be setting up, readying themselves to attack Jacob Frick. Brown Gordon begins to organize his troops into battle lines. He'll begin to set up his artillery on the hill that we just passed over the ridge there. There's a couple of folks that think he took his artillery all the way to the Midfield Farm where he sort of left from. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, especially when you can see directly east to us, and you can see that the Union line begins to bend back, and there's a salient point directly ahead of it. So really his artillery begins to open the battle with 40 artillery shots right over top the Union defenses to weaken them up. And among the Union militia at that salient point are 53 local black volunteers from Columbia. And John Brown Gordon, he's doing this artillery barrage really just to sort of scare these guys away and send them back across the river. By and large, it begins to work. These guys had never seen combat before. And they sort of begin to scatter. The black troops stay with the organized emergency militia, with some other home guard, there's some guys from Philadelphia, from Marietta, and beyond. They sort of scatter. They start heading back towards the river. The road we're following here was here in 1863. Confederate infantry would have been following this road. John Brown Gordon's plan is to come around the Union flank, so he would have been marching some infantry north and some on this road south to get around the Union flanks. One regiment of Georgians approached the center of the line after the artillery barrage, which kills for those 53 black men I should mention. He's the only killed casualty in the Battle of Wrightsville. He's got, but John Brown Gordon has one unit of infantry from Georgia, his home state, and skirmished get around the flank. So this was here in 1863. The road we're going to take would have been followed the railroad. The railroad actually went south following Croix Creek in the ravines here before it turned into Wrightsville towards the covered bridge. They're hoping to follow the railroad to get onto the bridge as well as around the Union left flank. All these stories from the Civil War that they say an army in the march sounds like a cacophony, because you can imagine carrying all this kind of crap with them. They've got their canteen, their kits, and usually before they enter a battle, guys are taking their stuff off and leaving them somewhere, and hopefully they were coming back. But at Wrightsville, we have stories that, at least from the accounts of Confederates, trust them or not, we'll take them at their word this time, they were so sort of quick to get here, and they knew that the sun was going to set soon, so they had to get in action. These guys were still carrying their kits with them as they're going into battle. So you imagine their canteens, their tin cups, their blankets wrapped around them, their knapsacks of cheese and bread. But they're carrying all that crap with them, as well as their 10-pound musket and 5 pounds of lead ammunition on their sides. And if it was as hot as it was today, yeah, they're wearing cotton uniforms, right, with their hats. Some of them probably don't have shoes. Imagine a lot of them have the wooden soled shoes, metal soled shoes. They have the nails at the bottom that scrape, make sparks, stuff like that. So probably not the most comfortable march, but they're getting their job done, so to speak. Left on a road that was here in 1863, but the Confederates going around the Union flank would have followed this road straight ahead, right across Croix Creek. There would have been a covered bridge there in 1863. When they retreat from Wrightsville, they burn all the railroad bridges as well as all of the foot traffic bridges, including the one that crosses Croix Creek there. Croix Creek is off to my left, so you're right down there. I'm kind of envious that I'm not taking a swim in it, but you can imagine the view from afar. Envious of blue water. Rough terrain the Confederates would have been traversing, lots of hills and ridges. All the farm fields off to your left, those were there in 1863. Obviously, lots of probably corn. We have stories of Union soldiers observing from a distance the Confederates coming through these very fields. So that one regiment of Georgia infantry that's spread out in skirmish lines would have been coming through this field here as they began to approach the Wrightsville down 462 and around 30. Great stories from Union observers, mostly Colonel Trigger wrote an after-action report. He said you can see the Confederates come up the rise in the distance, fire useless volley, sort of fall back. They've got their battle flag waving. They've got all their kit and caboodle on. So you know they're going up against probably a better force of Confederates, but they're using the hills in a very smart way west of Wrightsville, which they use the depth of it, the backside of the hill is cover, and then when they reload, they'll come back up to the top of the hill. Fire and go back down and retreat to reload. And they do this for about 30 minutes or so before they can begin to make their next real push on Wrightsville. Pretty little cemetery here on the side of the trolley. Lots of stricklers who would have been living here in 1863 are buried right there. That intersection we turned left at is artillery is about where we are now. They're the ones that they opened the battle lobbing sort of shells at the salient point of the Union line. And John Brown Gordon is watching from a distance as his army begins to go, his brigade begins to go into battle west of Wrightsville. show you best I can, so I'll yell. Yeah, that big U. That'll make it a big U. Even better if you're coming around that big U and the fire, you're hitting everybody all at once. So it makes it really effective. And that's going on right here. So the center of the Union line begins to break. They fall back pretty quickly after being fired on by artillery, as well as the Confederates. They're firing on them a little bit, but then they make a big push, and that big push sends the center of the line running, while south and north of us, the Confederates are now coming around and engaging on the Union flanks. Town cemetery here. Lots of Civil War veterans buried in here. Even some that were fighting with the Pennsylvania Emergency Militia. A lot of those Pennsylvania Emergency Militia units were local around the Harrisburg sort of greater metropolitan area. We'll put that in quotations. So a lot of guys from Wrightsville and Columbia. At the time, the cemetery would have been much smaller, sort of contained closer to the main road in Wrightsville. And a lot of this would have been open field. And at the end there would have been forest, sort of like there is, of course, or housing here. There would have been forest. Confederates are beginning to attack the Union left flank, which was anchored sort of just south of us, or pardon me, just east of us, closer to the river. Croyd's Creek sort of bends around these houses, actually to the south of us, now I got my bearings. And that's where the Confederates are coming through. That road that would have followed over the bridge, over the creek, comes right up into this here. That would have followed the railroad. Croyd's Creek. So right around here we have some local York militia that gets really entangled in really hot engagement as Confederates sort of coming up out of nowhere on their flank. Just remember a lot of these guys are militia, home guard, not really officially trained, and there's the Pennsylvania Emergency Militia who have training a week and a half at most. So these guys are very eager to get out of Dodge. So remember, like I said, the salient, the middle point begins to fall back. The flanks, totally unaware of that, until they see their friends hoofing it back towards the bridge, towards Wrightsville. Primarily about were there any Confederates killed at the Battle of Wrightsville? No, we know that there was a couple wounded as that unit charged sort of directly into the center point of the Union line, but none were killed. There's only one death that we know of. It was one of the 53 black volunteers. There was, I guess you could call it, there was a fatal wounding. The guy died a couple months afterwards from infection. He was a Union captain. There's a really funny story. There's a Union guy who gets shot. He doesn't have very dramatic Civil War things. I'm still live way in between the 90s, becomes a lawyer and died. Very, very old age. So in Wrightsville, the sheriff putting them a fighting retreat as they fall back. They're doing their best to sort of fight as they fall back, so they're sort of, you know, putting up some resistance, but getting out of danger at the same time. Pulling up to a house on the side of the road here, this brick house. We're going to jump ahead in the story a little bit because it's better geographically to do it here instead of turning around. This was the house of a woman called Mary Ann Rewalt. Mary Ann Rewalt was born here in Wrightsville. She was in her mid-20s. She was living here in the 1860s with her father, but her father wasn't here at the time. He was on business in New York at the time when the Confederates attacked Wrightsville. So, well, imagine now it's today, 160 whatever years ago, June 29th, the morning of June 29th, 1863. The bridge, spoiler alert, has been burned down. We'll get to that. John Brown Gordon is in Wrightsville with his officer staff. They come all the way from their headquarters here. Mary Ann Rewalt offers breakfast to John Brown Gordon and his officers. And as they go in, John Brown Gordon suspects she might have Southern sympathies. Because why was she being so dearly nice to them? So John Brown Gordon, as they're sitting around her breakfast table, he asks her if she has Southern sympathies. To which she replies, "Oh no. My husband, with my assent and approval, is fighting in the Union Army. That's why he's not here right now. This breakfast is simply a token of my appreciation and gratitude because the Confederates helped put out the fire before it spread to the right. So I didn't want you to go away without having some sort of token of appreciation. But I must tell you, it is my constant prayer to heaven that our Union is triumphant." So she really stuck it to a Confederate general and his officers' staff while being alone in Wrightsville in her very own home. And really, it's unfortunate. The only place we have this recorded is the memoirs of John Brown Gordon. John Brown Gordon, after all, was known to be like most Confederate officers, writing about their memories of the war. Most Civil War veterans, largely writing about the memory of the war. They were kind of dramatists. And John Brown Gordon was no purist when it came to writing about this. So he says that she was the most remarkable woman he'd ever met in 40 years of war. However, he gets her name and address exactly right, so there's probably reason to believe that this story is probably very true. And does anybody here, are you familiar with the author Gore Vidal, the novelist Gore Vidal? He wrote Her and Lincoln, those historical novels. That's his grandmother who lives here on his mother's side. Mary Ann Rewalt has a very interesting life. Her first husband passes away, she remarries, and they move all the way out to South Dakota, and that's where she's buried today. All the way out in South Dakota. She's born and raised in Wrightsville, sticks it up to the Confederates in 1863, and gets whisked away to the romantic plains of South Dakota, where she meets her death at a very old age. The show are falling back towards the river, and they're fighting retreat. Lots of old houses on the street that were here at the time of the Civil War as well. We have no dramatic bullet houses like Gettysburg has, but we can pretend. We do have buildings that were struck by artillery shells, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Well, actually, we're here. So the church, this was rebuilt in the later 1800s and 1890s, but the original church was built in the 1840s. It was a wooden building, and that wooden building had a really tall wood spire. It was more the shape of a house than anything, but it had a large wood spire that came up top. And as the Confederates were sort of just lobbing artillery shells at Wrightsville, one of them went through the church spire and went into the house across the street's attic. they found that artillery shell up there years and years later after the Civil War, and they pulled it out. That's this memento. As the Battle of Wrightsville spiraled into a much larger engagement where you have more than one or a couple guys being killed or wounded, churches like the First Presbyterian, the Wrightsville Presbyterian, would have been used ultimately as field hospitals. Churches were probably the most immediate places outside of barns at battlefields that were used as field hospitals. So had this become a Gettysburg-sized engagement, these churches all around Wrightsville would have been packed full of the wounded and dying. Still live kilns, which are very old, built in the early 1800s. They're still original. There's those stone structures with the sort of half circle entrances.